Hi, it's Brandon Slade from ThirstGym.com, and we're here for another Training Talk episode. And today we're going to talk about why conditioning is overrated for athletes. So I'm going to preface this and say I don't think athletes should be out of shape. What I'm basically trying to say is I think there's too much emphasis on the conditioning piece, especially when we're talking about the sport coaches versus the actual strength and power, agility, change of direction, anything from a performance perspective. Now, conditioning does have its roles and its importances, and I'll say this nicely that if your athletes are out of shape, then conditioning is important. But if your athletes are actually in shape, they're playing their sport, they're going to practice, they're able to actually go through practice without being out of shape in practice, they're probably in good enough condition for game time. And if they're not, then I would argue you need to work on that probably more in the preseason going into the season, or even in the off season, starting to slowly build that up as season approaches and doing some actual sport specific conditioning. And sport-specific conditioning is going to depend upon what sport you play, but ideally the goal is to try to never get out of shape to begin with. So most athletes, I feel like that's not a problem. I work with athletes for a living, and I see that most of them are generally not out of shape or deconditioned. There are some, especially when you start talking more about linemen or heavyweight wrestlers. Yes, they're not in as good a shape as like the lower wrestlers, or the wide receivers, or the running backs, but most of them are in good enough shape to do their sport, and especially if they happen to do this or play sports and do things year round. So the reason I'm going to say is that I think conditioning is overrated is because more coaches need to focus on the strength piece of the puzzle. So when we talk about athletes being able to put more force on the ground, jump higher, change direction, decelerate better, most of that stuff is limited by strength and or position, which is generally probably a strength related issue, unless if they happen to have something out of whack and for whatever reason they're in a bad position to begin with, right? But generally, like if we say we need to change direction and plant and open up, if an athlete has weak hips, does not have strong glutes, does not have the ability to drop into their hips to change direction, then it doesn't matter how good of a shape we're in because they're not going to be fast anyways. So I really like this from Mike Boyle that he said if you chase the speed portion first, you'll be a lot more satisfied with how you win games and how you perform than if you go down the conditioning rabbit hole and just try to condition and you wonder, why are we always slow? Well, because all you did was train slow, and generally that's what conditioning is for most athletes in sports. It's about being in shape, having a lower heart rate, being able to do something for 20 or 30 minutes consecutively, which again is important. But let's take a sport like baseball, for example. There's not a whole lot of conditioning that needs to be done for the sport of baseball. Baseball stands around a lot, and baseball players, I'm not hating on you, but they stand around a lot. They bat once every ninth person, right? 9 people bat. You could be in the outfield and the ball's never hit to you. You may not move a whole lot. So you don't need to be in a big, good aerobic shape to be able to play the sport of baseball, but you do need to be specifically in shape if, say, you're a catcher or pitcher. Those two positions need different training than your first baseman, your third baseman, your outfielder, because they're seeing more of the workload, and the conditioning can be specific to the task. So your pitchers, for example, if they need to be able to throw 60 pitches, then you need to build up conditioning specifically for pitching, not running poles back and forth on the field. So in those cases, work on way more speed, power, and strength development, because being able to hit harder, run down to first base, change direction to be able to make a play, that's all such big tasks in a short amount of time. That's all speed, power development. That has nothing to do with how many poles you can run and how good a shape you're in. Now, same thing with football, for example. You got to be in good enough shape, especially be able to run plays. And generally the work to rest ratio for most people is going to be like 1 to 5, 1 to 6 is usually what you'll find. So most plays are going to take 5, 6, 7 seconds, and then you're going to get about that 30, 35, 45 seconds rest depending upon what level of school you're in. But you'll probably find that if you can be in good enough shape for that, so basically you could have your guys run sprints, you could do 20-yard sprints and just repeat them and give them that same amount of rest, or even 40s, whatever. I think football's got done a better job of pushing the conditioning piece where it needs to be, but then you look at sports like softball and baseball and basketball, and they're really just trying to hammer kids to be in shape through conditioning and not working on the speed, power development side, and then they wonder why they're slow come season. So that's why think conditioning is overrated for most athletes. Again, you're going to have exceptions to the rule. You're definitely going to have athletes that need to be in good quality shape, especially your athletes that run like miles, 2 miles, that do long distance swimming. Yeah, those athletes got to be in good condition and good shape. But for most sports that require a lot of power, change of direction, and speed development, I think you'll find that the work to rest ratios are a lot bigger than you would actually think. And when those ratios get very big, then we start talking about developing more power and speed and being able to actually have those intervals match what we're doing in the sport. And then you're basically talking about doing sprints with some long duration rest. And then you can actually start to acclimate the athlete towards their specific energy development system that they need, and then you can be in shape without having to do a bunch of conditioning, and it's going to meet the task and demand that the athlete needs. So to summarize this really quickly, conditioning is overrated for the most part. If you focus on your speed, power, agility, and all that kind of stuff, and then use that to match your work to rest ratios, most of your athletes are going to come in good enough shape to be able to do their sport. And then you're going to have to focus on some specific positions. Certain sports are definitely going to be out there where you're going to have to focus on that a little bit more. But again, focus on that other stuff. The conditioning itself will take care of itself, especially in season. As long as you're practicing and you're doing things the way you're supposed to, you're not going to get out of shape. It's when you start pulling back on practices, you do way more technique and skill development stuff and start taking away actual things that develop conditioning in the practices, is that you start to see that fall off, which in that case, then you got to start developing conditioning in season. And ideally, you should have had the conditioning already developed before you got there on day one. So if you got any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. Thanks. Have a great day.